In the heart of the Bridger-Teton wilderness, the difference between a miracle and a tragedy is often just the length of a single cat's whisker, and for Albin Merrick, the frost breath of death was already scratching at his door. The winter of 2025 descended upon the Bridger-Teton forest with a weight that felt less like weather and more like an ending. It was a silence so absolute it seemed the world had forgotten how to speak, pressing its frozen palm against the old wooden cabin where Albin Merrick lived alone with his cat, Clover. For 37 years, that structure had held against the storms, but for the last 9, it had been a sanctuary of ghosts. It had been 9 years since Albin woke to find his wife, Mary, cold beside him, her hand still resting on his chest, as if even in death she wanted to hold him close. After her funeral, attended by neighbors whose kindness felt like stones dropped into a well too deep for echoes, Albin had withdrawn. He didn't make a grand statement. He simply drifted away from the world, like a tide moving out so slowly you only notice the shore is bare when it's already empty. Now, his world was the fire he kept burning, the tea he brewed in the morning, and the soft, cream-colored fur of Clover. Clover had been Mary's last rescue, a scrawny kitten found shivering behind a store just 3 weeks before Mary died. "This one needs us, Albin," Mary had said with that fierce tenderness she had for broken things. Now, Clover was the last living piece of her, and Albin cared for the cat with a devotion that bordered on ritual. That Tuesday morning arrived bitterly cold, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache when you breathe. It was supply day, a 4-mile walk to Pinedale for flour, tea, and the occasional luxury of bacon. At 73, Albin felt every step in his joints, but the movement kept him tethered to the living world. He dressed in layers, pulling on the thick wool sweater Mary had knitted him 20 years ago, and stepped out into a world transformed by overnight drifts. Clover, as she always did, insisted on coming. She trotted in his boot prints, a small ghost haunting her own life alongside the old man. They were 2 miles from the cabin, following the narrow road at the forest's edge, when Clover suddenly stopped. Her ears swiveled like radar dishes. Without warning, she bolted into the snow-laden underbrush. "Clover, come back!" Albin's voice cracked in the stillness. Panic, cold and immediate, flooded through him. He could not lose her. She was the last piece of Mary. He plunged after her, his boots filling with ice as he pushed through knee-deep snow. He found her 50 yards into the trees, circling an old pickup truck half buried in the snow. Clover was scratching at the undercarriage, her meows sounding like screams. When Albin knelt and peered beneath the vehicle, his breath caught. 2 bobcat kittens were huddled there, their matted fur frozen, their bodies trembling with a confusion that looked like grief. "What is it, girl?" Albin murmured, but Clover wasn't finished. She moved to the driver's side door, scratching frantically. Albin pressed his face to the frosted glass. Inside, sprawled across the bench seat, was an adult bobcat, the mother. The interior was a disaster of claw marks and shredded upholstery. She had sought shelter, the door had closed behind her, and she had fought until her strength gave out while her kittens waited outside in the killing cold. As Albin watched, she opened amber eyes clouded with exhaustion. There was no aggression in them, only a resigned weariness. Albin understood the silent plea. He found a rusty metal bar nearby and raised it. The passenger window shattered with a sound like breaking ice. Clover reached a white paw toward the glass, a gentle reassurance to the wild family. "Easy now," Albin whispered as he reached in, unlocked the door, and lifted the mother. She was solid muscle and matted fur, heavier than he expected, but he wrapped his coat around her and her 2 kittens, holding them against his chest like precious cargo. The walk back felt 3 times as long. His back screamed and his feet went numb, but he kept moving, 1 step at a time through the falling snow, carrying broken things home. When he finally reached the cabin, he laid the mother on the braided rug Mary had made. He worked with a frantic focus he hadn't felt in years. He stoked the fire until the flames roared, driving back the cold. He warmed milk and opened a tin of expensive pâté he had been saving. Since the mother was too weak to lift her head, Albin knelt beside her, feeding her spoonful by spoonful. As the kittens, whom he named Tarn and Luma, pressed against their mother's side, Clover took up a position as a sentinel. That night, Albin barely slept, adjusting blankets and checking heartbeats. He called the mother Mira in his mind, and as he watched Clover tug her favorite yellow blanket toward the wild cat, he felt something crack open in his chest. The cabin, which had been a mausoleum for so long, was suddenly alive with the sound of breathing. Albin looked at the 3 bobcats and his faithful Clover, and for the first time in 9 years, the silence didn't feel so heavy. Part 2. The Rhythm of Broken Things. The morning after the rescue arrived with a pale, gray light that filtered through the frost-rimed windows, revealing a scene Albin Merrick hadn't thought possible in his lifetime. On the braided rug Mary had made with her own hands, a wild, amber-eyed mother bobcat lay nestled within a fortress of towels and blankets. Beside her, Clover, a domestic cat who usually guarded her personal space with feline arrogance, was busy tugging Mary's favorite yellow wool blanket closer to the shivering predators. Mira, as Albin had begun to call the mother in the quiet of his mind, watched the domestic cat with eyes that were clearer than the night before, filled with a look that might have been gratitude. It was the beginning of a new, strange rhythm in the Bridger-Teton cabin, a rhythm dictated by the survival of the small and the broken, the vigil of the dropper. Because Mira was still too weak for her milk to return, the survival of the kittens, Tarn and Luma, fell squarely onto Albin's trembling shoulders. He fashioned a makeshift feeder from an old eye-drop bottle, cleaning it with obsessive care before filling it with warmed milk. The work was painstaking. Albin would sit cross-legged on the floor for hours, his 73-year-old joints screaming in protest, offering one tiny drop at a time. He had to be patient, waiting for each kitten to swallow before offering another, his hands shaking with a mixture of age and the sheer terror of failing them. Yet, in the quiet focus of the task, he found a meditative peace. The restless, morning noise that had occupied his head for 9 years began to subside, replaced by the rhythmic thrum-thrum of tiny heartbeats against his palms. Clover refused to be a mere spectator. She took up a position as a permanent sentinel beside Mira's nest. One evening, Albin watched in silent awe as Clover approached the wild mother and began to groom her, licking Mira's head with long, rhythmic strokes. She then turned to the kittens, washing their faces and ears as if they were her own flesh and blood. Mira accepted this domestic intrusion without a single hiss, her eyes half-closed in a newfound contentment. The storyteller in the wild. As the days bled into a week, Albin began to talk. It started as a way to soothe the kittens during feedings, but soon it became a confession. He told the bobcats about Mary, about the way she laughed so hard she could barely breathe, and about the backpacking trip they took when they were 25 and foolish enough to think they could hike the entire Continental Divide. He told them about their first winter in this very cabin, when the roof had leaked so badly they had to sleep under umbrellas, laughing until they cried. He shared the story of the only real argument they ever had, a fight over whether to get a dog, which was really just a mask for their shared fear of permanence and the terrifying vulnerability of love. One night, while feeding Luma, he recounted the great apple pie disaster. Mary had burned a pie so thoroughly it set off every smoke alarm in the house. They had ended up sitting on the porch in the freezing air, eating the ruined, charcoal-crusted dessert anyway, because, as Mary said, burnt sugar is still sugar. The bobcats didn't understand the words, but they responded to the cadence of his voice, their ears swiveling toward him as if they were absorbing the history of the man who had saved them. When Clover dozed off with her head resting against Tarn's leg, Albin felt something in his chest, a frozen block of grief 9 years old, finally begin to crack wide open. The storm and the awakening. In the second week, a fierce snowstorm swept in, isolating the cabin from the rest of the world. For 4 days, the forest became a white howling void. Inside, however, the mausoleum Albin had inhabited since Mary's death was becoming a home again. The silence was replaced by organized chaos. Tarn decided that Albin's broom was a mortal enemy, attacking the bristles with wild, uncoordinated enthusiasm whenever Albin tried to sweep. Luma discovered the old wooden clock on the wall, the one Mary had always complained was too loud, and became obsessed with the pendulum swing, eventually falling asleep directly beneath its steady tick-tock. Albin found himself moving differently. He had to check his footing constantly to ensure he didn't step on a prowling kitten. He couldn't sit in his rocking chair without a small, warm weight immediately claiming his lap. Most importantly, he found he could no longer grieve without interruption. One evening, Luma launched herself at the pom-pom on Albin's winter hat, missed, and tumbled in a heap. Albin let out a sound that startled him, a genuine, loud laugh. He realized with a shock that he couldn't remember the last time he had laughed. That night, he pulled out a journal Mary had given him years ago, one he had left empty because his thoughts felt too heavy for paper. With a pencil that felt light in his hand, he wrote his first entry. Day 19. Clover failed spectacularly at being the older brother. Neighbors and new purposes. When the storm finally broke, word of Albin's wild family began to spread through the small community of Pinedale. The Calloways, neighbors from 3 miles away, arrived one afternoon with jars of goat's milk and bags of dried food. Mrs. Calloway, looking at the bobcats resting by the hearth, said softly, "We used to worry you had frozen to death inside your own heart, Albin. But now you're alive again." Albin didn't know how to respond, but as he watched the kittens tumble over each other near the fire, he realized she was right. Driven by a new sense of responsibility, Albin began educating himself. He called the ranger station, speaking to a woman named Sophie. When he explained that he was caring for 3 bobcats he had rescued from the snow, there was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "You're doing a good thing, Mr. Merrick," Sophie finally said, her voice softening. "Not many people would. Not many people have Clover," Albin replied. As March arrived with its false promises of spring, the snow began to melt in patches. Albin spent his evenings carving a small wooden sign to hang on the cabin door. It read, "Welcome all souls." It was a promise to the wilderness and to himself, an open invitation to any lost being, and a testament to the man he had become again. However, as the air changed and the first green shoots appeared, Albin noticed a shift in Mira. She began to sit by the window for hours, staring out at the Bridger-Teton forest with a deep, unreadable restlessness. The wild was calling its children back, and Albin knew that the hardest part of the rescue, the letting go, was fast approaching. As winter grudgingly released its grip, March arrived in the Bridger-Teton forest with its characteristic false promises of spring. The world outside began to transform into a landscape of mud and dead grass, but beneath the decay, the first tentative green shoots began to stir. After months of heavy, frozen silence, the forest itself seemed to wake up cautiously. Albin Merrick began to spend more time outside his cabin, his 73-year-old body moving with a purpose it hadn't known for a decade. He repaired the roof where the winter ice had caused damage and built small, sheltered niches beneath the porch. He told himself these were merely for sparrows or rabbits, but deep down, he knew he was preparing the cabin for a future he could not yet name. In the evenings, he sat by the fire and carved a small wooden sign to hang on his door. "Welcome all souls." However, as the forest stirred, so did the wild family inside. Mira, Tarn, and Luma still lived within the cabin walls, but their nature was shifting. Mira spent long hours sitting by the window, her amber eyes fixed on the tree-line with an unreadable expression. Her restlessness grew until she began pacing the perimeter of the cabin, testing the air that leaked through the cracks of the door. One morning, Albin found that Mira had somehow managed to nudge the door open herself. She wasn't fleeing. She was simply sitting on the porch, staring out at her true home. When Albin approached her, their eyes met in a moment of profound understanding. "I know," Albin whispered. "I know you need to go home." The open door. From that day forward, Albin began leaving the door open a crack every morning, offering no explanation and setting no expectations. He watched as Tarn and Luma began to venture out, disappearing for hours to test their courage against the wild before returning to the safety of the fire. Albin never celebrated their return or watched them go with sadness. He simply maintained the routine, leaving 4 bowls of milk out every morning as a promise that the cabin would always remain a constant home. The inevitable moment arrived one evening as dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Albin realized the cabin had grown too quiet. There were no padding footsteps or expectant eyes waiting for dinner. Mira, Tarn, and Luma had gone together, and this time they did not return that night, nor the next, nor the one after that. The cabin felt emptier, though Clover's steady presence remained. The sense of the wild things lingered in the blankets, and the permanent claw marks on the furniture served as reminders of the family that had been there. Clover spent her days on the windowsill, chirping at the forest, and Albin would often sit beside her in a shared vigil, waiting for silhouettes they couldn't name. The return of the family. In April, a new shadow fell over the cabin when Clover suddenly fell ill. She refused her food and moved listlessly between the fireplace and the bed. Albin, terrified of losing the last living link to his wife Mary, sat beside the cat and read aloud from the journal he had finally started writing, his hands shaking as he turned the pages. As the sun set on a particularly difficult evening, Albin saw a movement outside the window. Tarn, now nearly full-grown, climbed through the opening Albin always left open. The young bobcat went directly to Clover, rubbing his head against hers with unmistakable affection. Clover's eyes brightened, and she touched her nose to his as Albin stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Tarn stayed for 3 days, encouraging Clover to eat and regain her strength. From that point on, a new cycle began. Tarn and Luma would return periodically, taking turns to ensure Clover was never lonely for long. Sometimes, on clear mornings, Albin would spot Mira standing on a distant slope. She never came close, but she watched, and for Albin, that silhouette was a gift, proof that their bond had not been erased by distance. The completion of a heart. The years continued their steady march. One autumn morning, when the leaves were like fire, Albin heard a familiar sound, a soft, questioning chuff. He looked through the door to see Tarn, Luma, and Mira all together. Mira looked at Albin, and in a gesture of profound acknowledgement, slowly lowered her head in a small bow. Albin, his eyes stinging with tears, nodded back. Family, he realized, did not need to stay close. It only needed to remember. As Clover aged and her cream fur faded to white, she and Albin continued their walks along the old road, though their joints ached and they had to stop frequently to rest. During the first snowfall of a later year, Albin saw the 3 shapes of the treeling one last time. They stood in silence, a final conversation happening without words. "Goodbye, my children," Albin whispered as they vanished into the falling snow. Live free. Standing there with Clover pressed against his leg, Albin Merrick felt something he had not felt in 9 long years. He felt complete. He knew that true love, no matter how wild or impossible, always finds its way back home.